Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Very glad to have all of you that have decided to join us as we kick off our 2020 Smithers Virtual Quality Conference. So before we get started, just some introductions and some housekeeping items. My name is Scott McDonough. I am the Director of Sales and Global Marketing with Smithers Quality Assessments Division. You'll notice that the chat has been disabled for this webinar. Please feel free to use the Q&A button to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We will take some time at the end to make sure that everybody's questions have been answered. After you exit the webinar today, you'll be redirected to a brief survey. We would appreciate if you would provide us some feedback so we know how you liked it. Our presenter today is Aaron Troschinetz. He is the General Manager, North America of Smithers Quality Assessments Division. Aaron's going to be presenting tips and tricks for remote auditing. So why don't we go ahead and get started.
Hello and welcome to Tips and Tricks for Remote Audit. My name is Aaron Troschinetz. I will be taking you through this webinar involving remote audit techniques. So the contents of today's presentation, I'm going to give you just a brief bio on myself, a little bit about my background, my work experience, and so forth. I will then talk about the background of remote audit, its origins, how it came about. We will talk about limitations with remote audit. Very important to understand there are limitations with using remote audit techniques. We'll talk about planning and executing, which kind of go hand in hand, the remote audit activity itself. We'll talk about some important safeguards. In today's age, with using any kind of virtual audit technology, it's important to consider safeguards and using the appropriate technology platforms. We'll then talk about finding the right remote audit balance. There is a balance that's required with using remote audit. So we'll talk about some of the aspects of that and what to consider when using remote audit appropriately. We will talk about as well specific approaches with remote audit in production. This has been a topic of discussion with every remote audit involving production, how to effectively audit those areas, what to consider when to going into production and so forth. And then we'll just kind of have a general summary of all the contents of the presentation and all the aspects involved with remote auditing. So a little bit about my background. I've spent over 20 years with equal time spent both in manufacturing and third-party certification industries. My manufacturing experience is directly within heavy truck, specifically engine and brakes, with various roles in machining, operations, quality, and program management. From a lead auditor certification standpoint, I've completed lead auditor certifications for ISO 9001, ISO 13485, which is the med device standard, AS 9100D, which is aerospace, and finally, what was previous ISO TS 16949, which is now IETF 16949, which supports the automotive scheme. And finally, I do have training both in Lean as well as DMAIC Six Sigma as well. So a little bit of background on remote audit. So from a third-party certification body standpoint, remote audit has been around for some time. For our standpoint, it was once what was called computer-assisted auditing techniques, or CAT, and it's now evolved into the most recent edition, which is information and communication technology, or otherwise known as ICT. So until COVID-19, SQA had only deployed remote audit, whether it be CAT or ICT, in very isolated cases. And some examples with these cases would include maybe a remote facility with limited functions that we would incur some issues with traveling to, where we could otherwise support an effective audit. However, obviously our world has changed due to COVID-19, and we recognize that this audit technique can help us get through cases where simply on-site audit activities are not possible. So for our clients and others, we recognize that many questions have surfaced regarding remote audit, especially the last few months. And we've taken this opportunity to assemble some tips and tricks for your consideration. And finally, remote audits take work. This is a very important point that I hope is impressed upon folks following this presentation, is that remote audits require a lot of considerations with planning on how the audit activity is going to get conducted. And then certainly while executing, what types of things do we have to work through in terms of conducting an audit using a remote technique. So they do take work, in terms of on-site audits. I would even suggest at times they require more work, as we'll see some of the things that go into conducting a remote audit. So let's talk about limitations. There are limitations, as with any tool, and remote audit is no different. There are limitations to consider when using a remote audit technique. A remote audit can present some challenges. We'll talk about the production process challenges as part of this presentation that may demand a blend of remote and on-site review of audit materials. I've seen some cases where maybe a hybrid audit using both some areas of remote audit where documents can be reviewed remotely, discussions can be conducted, to also include some on-site activity. So I say this because you need to consider that as you're considering how effectively the remote audit can achieve your audit deliverables at the end of the day. So there may be cases where some combination of both makes sense. Next item I would mention is remote audit, especially for internal purposes. For some schemes, and I have two examples here, automotive and aerospace, may not be sufficient to address your customer expectations or requirements. So take the time as you're considering remote audit to consider whether or not all those customer requirements can be effectively audited and covered within the scope of the remote audit activity. And finally, remote audit will present challenges if the necessary supporting technology platform, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, is not firmly in place prior to audit commencing. So make sure you work through those discussions. What is the technology platform? How is it to be administered? Because those are all things that you want to get out of the way in advance of starting the audit activity. So in regards to planning the remote audit overall, the first item to consider is take the time to plan the supporting remote audit technology platform. And by that, we mean determining the appropriate remote audit technology accessible for all involved auditees. Determine any features that must be enabled or disabled. One of the examples that comes to mind is recording. So for some organizations, they may not want to do recording as part of a remote audit activity due to the sensitivity, the confidentiality of some of the documentation that is being reviewed. So consider that in the planning phase as to what are the features of the technology. Does everyone have the appropriate access? And we'll talk about some ways to do that in advance of it actually being conducted. Next item, take the time to assess the risk of conducting a remote audit. What are the limitations? A specific example, line of sight with certain processes. With some processes, you may not be able to see everything you need to see using remote audit. So how do we manage some of those risks? Do we need to look at other areas as part of conducting the audit activity? And the second thing that goes along with this is considering processes that may be incompatible, simply incompatible with records being reviewed electronically. Maybe it's an area with an extensive amount of hard copy records. So considering in the scope of the remote audit, how are we going to facilitate that records change, looking at the samples we need to, achieving the audit deliverables is very important within the planning phase. Next item, take the time to develop an audit plan that supports a remote audit. And this sounds simple, but when we talk about this, we need to ensure that we're sensitive to the fact that we're not on site. So it's not a case where we can just float between one auditee to the next. So really take the time to work with the auditees to understand a schedule, and we'll talk about a couple of ways of doing that, that lend itself to the appropriate audit trails. The more you do that during the planning phase, the more the remote audit itself is going to be effective at getting through the audit requirements that you need to cover. So in terms of planning the remote audit, some additional tips and tricks. First, hold a practice run prior to conducting your first auditee discussion. This is an exercise now that we do across the board with any of our third-party remote audits, is we always ensure with the client organization that we're conducting a run-through to make sure everyone can get on the technology platform. There is an exchange of information that is able to happen that's appropriate in advance of the audit starting. Next item, assign auditee names to the audit plan and plan with appropriate technology platform meeting invites. This requires some extra work, but what it allows the audit to have is a certain structure by which the auditees know when and where they have to be available to support the audit being conducted. Next item, consider a block schedule. And I can speak from experience, remote audits for a full given day can be very exhausted. So what I mean by that is carve out a couple of blocks to conduct a certain portion of the audit with a break for an appropriate follow-up to maybe another audit trail. Covering it through a block schedule can be a highly effective tool to ensure that the auditee still has time to do their regular job, and will allow you to ensure that when you're in those individual blocks conducting the audits, that they're highly effective at getting you what you need to support the audit. Next item, consider focusing on production areas in the AM with follow-ups later that day in the PM. I've seen this to be an effective technique in regards to ensuring that we collect all the information we can within a certain block in the AM, and then allowing a period of review for the auditor for any appropriate discussions with certain individuals involved in the audit activity. This does help with some of the stress doing a remote audit in production areas, because then the auditee knows that there'll be some follow-on as to any lines of questioning. And the last item, plan for downtime, including gathering records, as this can be easily taken for granted. So when we're conducting on-site audits, I think we lose sight of the fact that we're able to do a lot of things at once. And oftentimes while we're doing something, the auditee can be collecting records that the auditor is asking for. So plan for this downtime within your remote audit schedule, allowing the auditee to collect the records that they need to, and any appropriate follow-on happen throughout the remote audit. So executing the remote audit. So some important items to start off with. Ensure you are running the show. Very important. So when we talk about this, remote audit can lend itself to the auditee doing more of the driving. I've seen this myself. So it's important that as the auditor, we are still directing with our line of questioning, where we want to go to see certain things. I think especially as remote audits tend to stretch on, the auditor will at times become a little complacent with driving the audit. One more reason possibly to consider a block schedule, but make sure that as the auditor, you're continually running the show. Next item, ensure you are taking the time to allow sufficient auditee response. I've seen this as well. Remote auditing does take a certain degree of pace. Not much different than on-site audits. However, one of the things that I think we need to guard against is not allowing the auditee sufficient time to respond to audit lines of questioning. And I think this is inherent within auditors. We want to keep pushing and finding information and seeing what we need to see. But we need to understand with remote audits, it does take more time. There is a lag when we're having conversations with the auditee. So keep that in mind as you're executing the audit. And the last item is make sure you are managing your appropriate sample levels. So remote audits at times can feel like a lot is being reviewed. If you consider the technology and everything else, it often feels like you have sufficient samples achieved. But what I've seen is a need for having next to you what your required sample levels are for any given process, and making sure that you're taking that into account while you're doing the remote audit itself. Because again, I think the tendency is to see one, two, maybe just a couple, and reaching conclusions in a remote audit setting, whereas normally in an on-site environment, we may be looking at substantially more records. So be cautious with that while using remote audit, and always make sure that you're hitting your appropriate sample levels as part of the audit activity. So some additional tips and tricks in regards to executing a remote audit. Keep in mind that remote audits do not lend themselves as easily to visual clues. So listening is paramount, and specifically attentive listening. So as you're going through your audit trails, make sure you're taking the time to clearly listen to the auditee, listen to the audit trail they're walking you through, because again, on on-site audits, we're able to do this using many more visual clues as to what the auditee is showing us and what it means. The next recommendation, using two computers or monitors for that matter, can be helpful to manage a visual with the auditee as well as reviewing the appropriate information at the same time. We always want to maintain a visual with the auditee. I think as people, we want that connection as far as having any discussions. So if you're only on one monitor looking down at information and then periodically looking at the auditee, it can cause a bit of an awkward setting for conducting the audit. So I would definitely recommend considering two monitors, two computers to address that issue. Next item, don't be afraid to use your mute, especially in large auditee group discussions. I would not suggest to have large auditee group discussions. The more effective ones I've seen have been one or two persons as far as going through a particular auditee discussion. But if it's required to do a larger group discussion, don't be afraid to use your mute with any background noise, any distractions that are happening. If you do this professionally and you say, look, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing what I need to hear, would you mind if we just mute to the few people that are having the discussion? That can be an effective tool to allowing you to stay on schedule and ensure that you're seeing and hearing everything that you need to as part of those audit exercises. And last, in production areas, ensure that the auditee is panning slowly so that you can have a full review of the supporting processes. We'll talk a little bit about this in the production discussion with remote audits, but using a slow panning of the area allows you as the auditor to ensure that you're seeing everything you need to see as an introduction into the production area. So some important safeguards with remote audits. So in today's age, with any kind of virtual technology, especially using remote audits, it's important to ensure that data is being safeguarded, as well as measures are still in place to ensure that the remote audit activity itself is being effectively executed. So some tips and tricks in regards to this particular item. Guard against sending any information to a non-secure company email address, and utilize as much as possible any kind of shared content feature within the technology platform. This is an important issue because, as I'm sure your IT managers can attest, sending to any non-secure company email address, a personal address, those types of things can take on a lot of risk as far as ensuring that the data is properly managed and getting to the right person. So always guard against sending any information as much as possible to any of those non-security company email addresses. And next, ensure that you are regularly reviewing the attendees on the remote audit for appropriate login with remote audit activity. So ideally, this goes back to the audit planning. You would be providing meeting invites to only direct audit attendees so you can mitigate any kind of inappropriate logins. So as much as you can do this with the technology platform that you're using, I think you'll find that you'll mitigate a lot of risk with non-intended persons coming into the audit discussions that could pose a risk as far as sharing of any information. So let's talk about the right balance with remote audit. I mentioned this at the onset. We need to recognize with remote audit, there is a risk that it can quickly become what we call a desk audit. And a desk audit is simply reviewing audit documents, making a determination of conformance without any kind of interaction with an auditee or someone involved. So it's important that as we go through a remote audit, we manage this risk and we find the right balance. So a couple of tips and tricks in regarding to finding the right balance. So in advance of the remote audit, consider documenting and outlining what you will be doing as part of the audit activity. And I've given you an example here. We will be requesting these documents in advance, samples to be followed with auditee discussion during the XYZ process. So obviously you could add a lot more detail to that, but just communicating in advance to the auditee, allowing them to prepare for the remote audit activity itself will ensure that you're able to see the things that you need to see and appropriate follow-ups can be conducted. Next item, following a process approach is strongly recommended to ensure that remote audit does not become isolated to a given process, and process interfaces are appropriately covered. So one of the risks I have seen with remote audit is a siloed process approach is taken, where, for instance, we only review the purchasing process. The risk with that is if we're not reviewing those interfaces going in and out of the purchasing process or inputs and outputs, we can miss important process breakdowns because oftentimes what we find is the interfaces is where the process breaks down itself. So consider that within your audit plan as to how to cover those interfaces so you're not just taking a singular process audit approach and losing sight of the overall collection of processes within the given management system. So specific practices, approaches with remote audit in production. So there will be challenges with production areas. Some of these that we've encountered, noise, proximity you're able to get within the production operators for interviews and so forth. So it's important to plan ahead on the overall appropriate approach. So some tips and tricks. First, consider reviewing the process flow chart and operator work instructions with the auditee prior to visiting production areas so that samples can be identified and targeted. So this goes into the planning aspect of conducting a remote audit. The more you understand their process, and a flow chart is a great tool to do that, the more you can plan ahead as to what you want to look at, where you want to look at it, so that you have a clear plan going into the production area as opposed to kind of conducting it ad hoc or on the spot. Be targeted with your operator line of interviews, and as much as possible, have a clear idea of line of questions prior to visiting any production areas. So this isn't a case that we're providing the auditee, okay, here are the questions I'm going to ask you. This is for the auditor himself or herself to understand, okay, when I go to this given area, these are the types of questions I'm going to ask the operator based on my review of the flow chart, any work instructions, items such as that. So you can make the audit more effective and get to what you need to get to as part of the audit activity. So during the production area visit, the other recommendation I would make is consider having the auditee have an additional person to support the smartphone or supporting technology platform for video. As we have seen from the third-party side of things that it can be difficult for the auditee to try to be handling, the smartphone, looking at what you need to see as the auditor on the other end, and effectively answering your questions at times. So consider suggesting to the auditee, hey, how about you have somebody else operate the smartphone? Obviously you'll be in the lens of view if any questions come up. So that allows them to focus on answering your questions and getting you the information you need. And last, when visiting a production area, have the additional person, hopefully, supporting the smartphone for video, give you a full view of the area. I encourage auditors to do this just from the standpoint that that can be your virtual tour from the onset of what is the process overall. If you've reviewed the process flow chart and any of the supporting documentation, that should help you fill in the blanks with actually seeing the process before you start down your audit trails. That can be helpful to kind of put the auditee at ease, get them comfortable with the smartphone or supporting technology so that they can then move on to the audit questions after you've seen the entire area. So, in summary, remote audit is a tool that has been in existence for some time, and certainly during these unprecedented times can be necessary to ensure that the auditing of our management systems continues to be executed. I don't think there's any question that remote audits will never replace the effectiveness of on-site audits, but in cases, they can be conducted effectively. And using some of the pieces of the discussion we've had today, I think you can consider where they may be appropriate and where they may be inappropriate. As always, there are limitations. We did talk about some of that with remote audit. Those limitations must be managed. I think it's important to go through the exercise at the onset of audit planning to say, okay, what are the limitations that we may incur as part of conducting the remote audit? So it's important to get those out of the way, identified on the onset so that you can understand how you're going to manage some of those limitations in the course of the remote audit. Next, planning the remote audit is equally, if not more important than a typical on-site audit activity. As you can see, there's a lot that goes into the planning if a remote audit is to be effective. So as much of that you can focus on during the planning phase with the auditee, working carefully through those associated details can make the remote audit go more smoothly. Next, during the execution of the remote audit, it's important to manage the pace and with appropriate structures in place. So we talked about pace as it pertains to remote audit. I don't think there's any question that none of us are designed to do 8 hours or more remote auditing. It's not ideal. It's not a very good experience to go through. So consider some type of schedule, whether it be through blocks or staggered audit segments that you go through to ensure that you can get through what you need to, but still manage some pace within the activity. Next item, remote audit requires the right balance. We talked about that right balance as to whether or not maybe still some on-site activity would happen in addition to the remote. And it does require you to consider receiving items prior to the auditee discussions to ensure that all those things are getting reviewed. Then at the same time, the appropriate auditor-auditee interaction is happening. Next item, production areas with the right support and planning can be audited with effectiveness. We talked about some of those things in advance of going to the production area, what to prepare ourselves with as auditors. But equally as important, when you get to those production areas, some of the things and techniques that you want to deploy to ensure that the auditee is able to effectively get through the audit on their end. And then finally, there are some additional links and information which I would offer to you. The first one there is IF Mandatory Document 4, which is the mandatory document specifically for ICT. There's a lot of good material in that as to ICT techniques that we use as certification bodies. Some of that may be worth considering in the construction of a remote audit program for internal audit purposes. The next one is IF ID 12. This talks about principles of remote audit. This is kind of an all-encompassing guide of different principles to consider, everything from auditor competency to supporting systems involving remote audit techniques. And finally, there is a Technical Committee 176 document, which talks about auditing practices. It's a pretty thorough document, but it has a lot of great information as to different considerations when using remote auditing that are worth considering. So with that, once again, I want to thank all of you for being a part of our presentation today. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Aaron. So we did get a few questions, and I'd like to just remind everybody that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function to enter your questions. We can start answering those now. One of the ones that came up early on that I just want to make a note for everybody that attended today, we will be making these videos available online at smithers.com. So in the next probably week or so, we will be sending out a notification via email to everybody that attended or registered, so that you can go and take a look and find this video and review it again if you wish. So look for that to come out soon. So Aaron, one of the questions we got was, how long will ICT audits be permitted and what criteria makes them appropriate?
Yeah, so that's a great question. ICT in its current format is actually fallen under, for aerospace and ISO, some COVID-19 specific provisions whereby it can be used across the board effectively for all programs. Automotive has not provided that allowance at this time, but there is no set timetable for that. But certainly post-COVID-19, within the ISO program itself, there will continue to be certain sets of provisions as to when and where it is allowed. But all that is yet to be determined at this time.
Great. Another question we received is, what are some examples of the typical problems that you've encountered? And how long do these issues take to get past with attendees?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So 3 or 4 that come to mind offhand, and they were actually mentioned in the presentation as well. The first one that I've seen a number of examples with is rushing audit trails with limited samples. And I'll give another example as to seeing that was one specific instance within a purchasing process audit trail where 1 or 2 POs or purchase orders were taken before the auditor reached a conclusion as to a deficiency during the audit. So again, it's very important to keep in mind that I think as remote audit lends itself at times to assume that we've seen enough. And we need to keep in mind, okay, what would we typically look at as part of an on-site audit activity? So it's important to keep those sample sizes in mind. The other one that comes to mind is having the production area be more of a walkthrough versus an actual audit. And I've seen a couple examples of this during remote audits is we kind of get the virtual tour and then, you know, we say, okay, we've seen enough in production, when in actuality, again, if we were on site, we would be looking at work instructions, having interviews with operators. So that's where it goes back to the planning aspect of really having a good game plan as it pertains to the production area. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend to kind of do the virtual tour and then the audit. You know, start out with the discussion with the auditee of, okay, let's pan through the area. Let's see what is involved in the area, and then starting the audit, post that kind of virtual tour. A couple other items that I'd mention, not taking into account information collected within the overall audit time in terms of planning. So again, virtual audits lend themselves to lag time in terms of collecting documents. So it's important that as you're creating your audit plan, that you take that into account, that the auditee needs time in a virtual setting to collect those records and provide them. And then the last one is the isolated process review issue. So again, if we take a siloed approach with our creation of the audit plan, not taking into account those interfaces between the different processes, there's a real risk that we're going to be missing items in terms of, you know, conducting a comprehensive audit. And what I've seen people do in terms of mitigate that is make sure that they're following their plan with logical process audit trails. So typically, maybe they're doing some of the inputs to the production process, let's say on the front end of the agenda, so then they can later consider that when they do the process review of the production area itself.
Thank you. Another question was, how would you suggest reading body language remotely since you are not with the auditee in person?
That's a great question. And I think it just takes practice. I think certainly if you have any prior experience with the auditee on site, you've got a significant advantage in terms of working through that. But if you don't have any prior experience with the auditee and your first encounter with them is in a virtual setting, it can be really tough. And I've seen examples where it's a bit awkward in the beginning. And I think as auditors, this is where we need to make sure we're asking confirming type questions as to, okay, did I understand that you said this way? Or I heard you say this, did you mean this? I think it's a lot of not making assumptions and really taking the time for the auditee to answer the questions and make sure as the auditor that you understand clearly what they're giving you in terms of any messaging.
Another question, are there limits on how many ICT audits can be done in a row without any on-site audits for our internal audit program?
No, there is not. But the one thing I would caution folks with is specifically in automotive and aerospace is really make sure that you understand your customers' expectations with internal audits. And I'll give you an example. Within automotive, your customers may expect some additional on-site audit activity where you may have to do a hybrid of, a piece of it remote as well as some of it on-site as it pertains to product quality type requirements. So you really have to make sure that you understand the customer end of expectations with remote audits before deploying it across the board. But there is no limit itself as to internal audits, how many can be done consecutively.
Great, thank you. Another question, we are a small local Akron, Ohio company. Will there be on-site audits done at all, or are they all going to be done remotely?
I think it's too early to tell. Like I said, under these extraordinary circumstances, we are doing a fair amount of ICT. We're also seeing a fair amount return to on-site, depending on external visitor requirements and any of those types of things. But I think it's too early to tell as to how long we're going to be doing ICT audits for a number of our programs. And a lot of it is just based on the discussions that we're having directly with the client and any of their given circumstances.
Great. Are videos recorded for later review? What is the risk and protocol for the videos themselves?
So videos as it pertains to remote audits, I believe as I mentioned in the presentation, we made the decision ourselves to disable the video feature because our concern was specifically taking in any type of sensitive information, ITAR type information, for instance. So we didn't want to cross that bridge. And I mentioned for some organizations, they may want to make that same decision internally, that they don't want recording of those types of things to be stored within their system. So I think you really have to consider what you're going to be coming into contact with in terms of information and make that decision appropriately. And I would recommend for internal audit purposes, you certainly involve your IT team to have them help you understand where things are going to be stored, where they're going to be located, so you can make that decision appropriately.
Thank you. Another question, what tips would you give to make the auditee feel more comfortable and at ease with remote auditing?
So great question. I think it goes back to the practice run. I would even suggest, you mock into an audit trail with the auditee so they can feel comfortable as to how you're going to exchange information how you're going to ask your line of questioning, because it can differ a little bit versus our on-site audit activities. I've seen that from my observation. So I think it's going through that practice activity, making the auditee feel comfortable with how you're going to be asking questions, collecting information, so that you can make it as successful as possible.
Great, thank you. Next question, automotive for corporate high-level audits. Are ICT permitted for that side? They're in a different state. I was on site. I completed the production line side.
So I think it kind of depends on what you're defining as automotive for corporate high-level audits. There's certainly a lot of any of the standards that we operate with that can be conducted very effectively via remote as it pertains to some of the main components of the management system requirements. That lends itself very well to remote audit techniques. When you get into the production areas, as this question would suggest, that's where you need to consider maybe some combination of a hybrid audit, you know, some remote, some on-site. So I think it really depends on the situation, but there's nothing prohibiting some of the higher level requirements for internal audit purposes for being conducted remotely.
How will not being able to video our production area affect the virtual audit?
I haven't seen any impact from it. In our third-party audit experiences, like I said, across the board, we don't do any recording. Even if the auditor wanted to record something, we've already gone ahead and disabled the feature proactively because, like I mentioned before, we don't want to be taking any information into our systems that may be at risk. So I haven't seen any impact from it. What I have seen, though, going back to the question before, is I have seen us at times kind of get through the production walkthrough with the virtual tour and probably cut off our production audit trails prematurely in terms of following the depth that we would normally go through. So that's why I recommend you kind of handle it as two distinct activities within the production area.
Great, thank you. Another one, at what point is it determined what type of audit should and will take place? What are the decision factors to make that right decision?
So this goes back to the planning. I think, especially for internal audit purposes, this is where the quality manager or whoever the individual is that's responsible for the internal audit program itself, be having that discussion with the management rep and the affected audit teams to determine when and where the ICT audit should go in certain areas and what should be covered within it. But like I said, you know, the planning is really the meat and potatoes as it pertains to remote audits. That's where you can make a difference for remote audit to be ineffective versus effective.
Thanks, Aaron. What is the technical platform that Smithers is using for virtual audits?
So we use Zoom here at Smithers. We have a number of licenses that we control, and we control those licenses as far as getting any of the regular security updates and things of that nature. I know some of our clients use WebEx. They found that to be an effective tool. I've seen some examples with Microsoft Teams to be effective. So, you know, again, it really depends on what your IT team recommends, what your selected platform is. But we found Zoom to be a very effective tool for our third-party audits.
Great. Remote audits for sites outside the U.S. is challenging due to time zone differences, especially in Asia. Does Smithers foresee more remote audits for sites within the U.S. and outside the U.S.?
I do. We've already done, prior to COVID-19, we did a number of audits in Asia using remote audit techniques. And it can be a challenge with the time change. And that's another thing that as the audit team sets themselves up, they need to consider those things as to how you're going to manage the time change, because obviously when conducting an audit in Asia, per se, you're going to have to consider the schedule, and the auditor or audit team is going to have to make themselves available for a schedule that's conducive to the audit taking place in another region.
Thanks. Next one, will the required audit hours be impacted by the remote audit?
Yeah, this is interesting. You know, initially when we started with remote audits, and we've done probably over 200 to date, we heard a lot of discussion with our auditors that they were finding, initially at least, that the audit planning was slightly increased in terms of what they had to do to get ready for the audit. And I think as our auditors have adapted to virtual, they've probably seen less impact on the actual audit taking place in terms of collecting records. But I think, especially initially, you have to be aware that it's going to take some getting used to. And specifically with the collection of records, is that we saw initially a number of folks that took longer time to collect things and things like that. So I think that takes a little getting used to as far as conducting the audit itself.
Aaron, do you see ICT audits becoming an option for IETF 16949 in the future?
So we've had a number of these discussions with the IETF oversight group. I do not foresee ICT becoming an option for automotive. We've been told very specifically that it's not in the plans. I know the discussion has happened. If you go out to the IETF website, they have a guidance set of materials that are out there, and it does not lend itself to ICT whatsoever.
Great, thank you. Looks like we have one final question. How would you suggest that a company set up and conduct supplier audits to comply with requirements of quality standards? Would it suffice to meet the requirements in a third-party audit?
So it certainly could. I think this is another one of those discussions as to how you construct the program itself. But I could see where ICT could be, or remote audit techniques in general, could be an effective tool for supplier audits. I could also see examples where maybe a hybrid example program would need to be constructed, because again, I would think as the customer, you would still want to have some hands-on going through production areas on specific product requirements. But I could see where certainly doing remote audit for some of the core management system requirements for a given supplier could very effectively be done using a remote audit technique.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Looks like that is the last of our questions. Aaron, I'd like to thank you again for presenting today. That was a great presentation. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you wouldn't mind, when you exit the webinar today and complete the brief survey that we have set up, we would much appreciate that. Also, again, these videos and recordings that we are conducting this week will be available on smithers.com, and look for your an email notification when those are available. So with that, again, thank you very much for everybody's time, and we hope to see you at another webinar yet this week. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.